Along with Versailles, it is the most imposing castle in France. Located on the edge of an opaque forest of 20,000 hectares with more than 10 million visitors per year. Fontainebleau in the Île-de-France.
Fontainebleau is a huge place with buildings that spread in all directions.
There are over 1,500 rooms, and the number of people who would occupy it under a particular monarch would be up to 2,000.
Fontainebleau's builders achieved true architectural feats, like Francis I's Gallery, which was created in the 16th century, 150 years before Versailles' Hall of Mirrors.
The Francis I Gallery at Fontainebleau is generally acknowledged to be one of the great masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance in Northern Europe.
The architects had to face severe challenges. Rarely had such a volume of stone been transported from so far away.
The stone carts that go down the Oise and then up the Seine are transported on boats to Fontainebleau.
Never before had such a vast canal been built, a structure more than a kilometer long, unprecedented in the 17th century.
It must have been almost a small army that had to actually dig this canal because it involved a lot of earth moving.
Fontainebleau was the only home of all the dynasties of France.
It's been the home for 34 kings and 2 emperors, and they've all left their marks on this building.
From the 12th to the 19th centuries, Francis I, Henri IV, the Sun King, and even Napoleon, all of them have contributed to making Fontainebleau a sprawling complex. Construction, destruction, earthwork, and underground work, they were ready to do anything to express the greatness of the crown through the stone of Fontainebleau.
It's a venture that nowadays seems quite incredible, knowing that all that time they didn't have the sophisticated means that we have today.
Lasting 8 centuries, this is the fantastic odyssey of the longest construction project in France, during which the true residence of the kings was shaped. Fontainebleau, 70 kilometers south of Paris. An extraordinary castle stands on the edge of a huge wooded massif. An eclectic estate of 46,500 square meters, 10 times larger than Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It is embellished with 130 hectares of parks and gardens. A superstructure composed of 1,536 rooms, 4 courtyards, 3 huge galleries, 2 chapels, and a theater. It was not the work of a single man, but a multitude of kings who built for more than 8 centuries.
It's a project that is continually taken up by all the rulers. Each sovereign will want to leave his mark here at Fontainebleau, whether in the castle or here in the gardens.
But how did this royal megastructure come into being? What incredible techniques were deployed by its builders to radiate the power of the crown? At the origin of the Château de Fontainebleau, this gigantic forest on the outskirts of Paris, the epicenter of power, and a game, the favorite game of all the kings of France, hunting.
Royal hunting within the forest of Fontainebleau actually go back to the 12th century. But I suspect that as long as there was a forest belonging to the kings of France, then there was hunting.
For the kings of France, hunting is really what sets them apart from the rest of the world. It's also a way of practicing, since in the end, it prepares them for war. It's a very physical activity.
An activity to express your skill and especially your power, on a unique site in France, privileged, protected from noxious smells and plagues.
Over the centuries, it was considered that the fact that Fontainebleau was surrounded by the forest at a certain distance from Paris, the air quality was better than in the capital. And it is true that in the Middle Ages, when the Great Plague of the 14th century broke out, the court took refuge in Fontainebleau, and it must be acknowledged that it survived without damage.
Clean air that they thrived in, and the presence of clean water also in abundance. Not very common at the time. Water that would be at the heart of everything.
Fontainebleau is an extraordinary place, which, like all extraordinary places, takes its name from a legend. Legend has it that a dog in the Middle Ages got lost during a royal hunt, and he discovered a fountain. The fountain gave name to the dog, and the dog's name was Biot, so the fountain was called Fontainebleau, beautiful water fountain, Fontainebleau, and so it became known as the Château of Fontainebleau.
The story of the lost dog might be legendary, but the fountain is still present in Fontainebleau. In the Middle Ages, the site therefore had some assets, but it also had a formidable vice. It is located in the middle of swamps. It is impossible to imagine building a solid foundation. Against all odds in the 12th century, when Saint Louis, the righteous and reformist king, went to Fontainebleau, there is already a building there. Surprising when you know the terrain and archaic means of the time. But it is still only a modest fortified hunting lodge to deter those who would try to attack the king. The grounds of Château de Fontainebleau then consisted of a 30-meter-high keep intended to accommodate the sovereign, and an oval courtyard protected by defensive buildings and surrounded by a moat.
It was a small castle. At the time, it was really a hunting lodge. It is rather a modest place, in fact, but which is still important because there was a large keep that remains today.
From the medieval castle, only the keep remains today, a massive construction with a square base.
Not just anyone was allowed to build a keep, and the sovereign had his room on the first floor, and this king's room was installed there until the Renaissance.
Designed to protect the king from the most violent attacks, the walls of this keep are more than 3 meters thick and have an internal circulation system. Stairs built within the walls ensure the passage of the guards, who can walk around the building and move from floor to floor without ever having to cross the sovereign's living rooms. An architectural achievement, but a proven technique in these early Middle Ages when the ruler must constantly protect himself, and by any means necessary. Nevertheless, the first building in Fontainebleau is still far, very far away from the enormous palace it is about to become. Two centuries later, from 1337 to 1457, the 100 Years' War raged between France and England. Abandoned, the Château de Fontainebleau will fall into ruins.
The abandonment of Fontainebleau in the 100 Years' War is in part a reflection of the fact that it wasn't a particularly defensive site.
In the middle of its immense forest, the castle is therefore forgotten. But a new king of France will soon change the course of its history, deploying Herculean energy to transform the modest building into a grandiose Renaissance palace. 2 courtyards, a gigantic gallery, imposing buildings never seen before in the Kingdom of France on such unforgiving ground. This monarch is Francis I. Crowned in Reims in 1515, he is the emblematic king of the French Renaissance. The great rival of the German Emperor Charles V and a determined builder. One of the residences on which he will set his sights, Fontainebleau.
Francis I at one point fell in love with Fontainebleau, that's for sure. The king will come for the pleasure of hunting red and black prey. In other words, wild boars, deer, and roe deer.
I like particularly the quotation overheard from Francis I in 1543, where he said, "Even when I'm in my coffin, I'm going to go hunting."
hunting, always and forever, and also with the proximity of the capital.
Being sufficiently far from Paris for you to be able to escape the city, but it's sufficiently close to be able to be in regular touch with the governing heart of the kingdom.
Accustomed to the Château d'Amboise, the king likes pomp and splendor. And he also wants to assert his power, so if he has to reside in Fontainebleau, the residence must be worthy of his rank. But with the ruin he inherited on slippery terrain and unstable ground, the task looks perilous. Fortunately, Francis I will be helped by the forest. Its surface area offers an inexhaustible resource of wood for construction, and the nature of its ground provides an abundance of stone, sandstone.
So we have, all around the Fontainebleau basin, where we are now, quarries that have always been used to extract the stone, which is very resistant.
The sandstone of Fontainebleau is so exceptional that it was used for the paving stones of the Château de Versailles and the entire city of Paris. So Francis I's plan used the resources at his disposal. But how to build the palace he dreams of on the marshy ground of Fontainebleau? His clever idea to keep the foundations of the medieval castle located around the oval courtyard. They are the only ones that have stood the test of time, so they are immutable. The king simply had the walled enclosure and the towers knocked down to build new buildings. He also restores the keep that will house his apartments, the keep that is still the heart of the current castle. Passionate about this project, Francis I visualizes everything, decides everything, helped only by his construction manager, Gilles Le Breton. At the time, he had no architect. So then how did he achieve this feat? His strength, the deployment of a colossal workforce that will work day and night to satisfy his desires.
The first construction campaign that will allow the king, his family and his entourage to settle in the castle of the oval courtyard. It takes about 2 years, but it's a very short period of time. Today we wouldn't do any better with the technical means we have.
A first construction period from 1528 to 1530, which climaxes with this 34-meter-high entrance, the Golden Door. Consisting of several superimposed and richly decorated arches. Inspired by his Italian campaigns, it is the castle's first Renaissance structure, the one that will open the way to everything else. Unique in its kind, this entrance is designed to impress, and Francis I is not going to stop there. A few years before the king's return to Fontainebleau, the Emperor Charles V humiliated Francis I by holding him captive in Madrid for over a year, and the French sovereign has never forgotten.
The captivity of Francis was a catastrophe, a disaster of the first proportion.
Francis I's captivity in Spain marked him forever, but many of the changes in him were good ones in the sense that he had a very clear sense of what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. What would have broken lesser men gave him renewed strength and made him into the remarkable monarch we know.
Fontainebleau will be the scene of his revenge. Francis I wanted to restore his reputation and demonstrate his power to his rival Charles V. It was therefore necessary for him to do new construction. From 1531, the sovereign ordered the creation of a group of imposing buildings on the site of an old abbey bought by the crown. 4 new wings arranged around a closed rectangular courtyard were built and tripled the surface area of Fontainebleau. It then became the largest castle in France, ahead of Chambord. The work of which Francis I will be most proud, his Renaissance gallery, which now connects the new rectangular courtyard to the former oval courtyard. Never before had someone built such a structure in France. It was the privilege of Rome. Its immense covered walkway, 60 meters long, had to surpass all that existed at the time. It became the largest of all the kingdoms in Europe, the most sumptuous too.
The gallery has a double function: practical, so to get from one place to another or wander around, and symbolic, by demonstrating the richness or culture of the person who has built it.
A luxurious and colossal corridor created 1.5 centuries before Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. Francis I kept the key around his neck and reserved it for his distinguished guests. No one should ignore that it's his creation. Throughout, he puts his initial F and his emblem, the salamander, on it.
The salamander expresses immortality. It's an animal, a reptile, that is supposed to be able to withstand fire, that is supposed to rise from the flames. For the king, it is to symbolize his durability, his permanence, his immortality.
To decorate his gallery in his castle, Francis I stopped at nothing. He brought the greatest artists of the time from Italy. Patronage was his way of asserting his supremacy. Fontainebleau was then likened to a new Rome.
The King of France is the most powerful, richest and generous sovereign with artists throughout Europe. The France of the time is New York, in a way.
Francis I enjoyed such popularity among artists that Leonardo da Vinci himself bequeathed him his precious Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa, which adorned the walls of the private apartments of the monarchs in Fontainebleau until 1666. Beyond the arts in stone, Francis I is always thinking bigger. He wants to reshape the land, to control the hostile nature that surrounds him. But just how to tame marshy, wild lands crossed by a stream? The sovereign is stubborn. He finally found a solution. By diverting and draining the stagnant water into a network of small, tight canals, he was able to create a large 8-hectare Renaissance garden and design an even set of 12 rectangular islets. At the cost of methodical work, Francis I's workers succeeded in taming the water, which was previously only a hostile force.
A piece of land that is at first sight poor will turn out to be something quite exceptional and very interesting to develop.
Satisfied with his achievements, in 1539, Francis I considered that the time had come to invite his great rival to Fontainebleau, Charles V, an opponent with whom he had been contending for too long. The German emperor has to cross France to reach Flanders, where there is an insurrectional climate, but he doesn't want to linger in Fontainebleau.
François I thinks otherwise. He wants to dazzle him, impress him.
Francis I, with perhaps a little strategy in his mind, he organized a whole sequence of huge festivities.
A demonstration of power that Charles V is forced to attend. In turn, he was at the mercy of his enemy. Francis I gloats. Thanks to his Renaissance castle, which he will develop until his death in 1547, he is able to snuff out his rival and assert his omnipotence to the world. His successors will never stop preserving his legacy. When Francis I died, Henri II, his son, was crowned King of France. His wife is the terrible Catherine de Médicis. Their common ambition, to reappropriate the Château de Fontainebleau. Henri II grew up in these walls, but at the end of the 16th century, he feels that the building has aged. Catherine de Médicis demands that the sandstone de Fontainebleau be replaced by the most noble stone in France, limestone.
Gabriel, Louis XV's architect, said, "But it's not possible for the king to use a stone as ugly as sandstone."
But in Fontainebleau, there is no limestone. It's in the north of Paris, 100 kilometers from there, that the king's workers will find this most beautiful stone. In the quarries of Saint-Leu-la-Forêt, the same stone that the Sun King will use for Versailles. Except that transporting it in the middle of the 16th century is a delicate business.
On fait circuler sur des bateaux les charrois de
The
fer.
stone carts that go down the Oise and then up the Seine are transported on boats to Fontainebleau.
Pour venir jusqu'à Fontainebleau.
So the presence of the Seine next to the castle is like a highway.
The limestone will have to conceal the sandstone.
La façade de la galerie François
The
I.
facade of Francis I's gallery was covered by these stones, these golden stones. And here we can see in the doorway what remains of the sandstones from Francis I's time.
François I.
Sandstone is a relatively rough stone, so they will use a softer limestone, easier to cut, easier to work with, and from which they can more easily have impeccable joints.
This transition from sandstone to limestone explains the differences in the tones of the facades, characteristic of the Château of Fontainebleau. But this wasn't enough for Henri II and Catherine de Médicis. A masterpiece is missing from their castle, a huge reception room for their distinguished guests. The king orders its construction in one of the wings of the oval courtyard, in an unexpected place where Francis I had planned to build a covered terrace.
On pense que le projet initial.
We think that the initial project of this room was a simple loggia, with openings to the outside and large vaults whose profile we still have above the chimney.
Au-dessus de la cheminée.
Originally, pillars were designed to support one monumental vault. To destroy them would be heresy. Henri II decided to keep the impressive masonry. Instead of the vaults, he had an extremely ingenious coffered ceiling built. Thousands of metal rods are suspended from the framework that rests on these pillars, holding a huge wooden grid. It is on this suspended structure that the decorative coffers will be glued.
The ceiling is very spectacular and seems very massive because the reliefs are very important. This ceiling is only a decoration. It's suspended by important metal structures from the frame which itself supports the roofing.
Reception room, limestone facades. Under the reign of Henri II, Château de Fontainebleau became more noble, but it was under the aegis of one of his successors that it became sprawling. The king who would really make his mark on Fontainebleau was Henri IV, who became King of France in 1589.
Henry IV is known to this day as Le Bon Roi Henri, the good King Henry. So it's fair to say he was liked during his time and has come down to us as perhaps the most likable of all French monarchs.
The ruler who inherits a kingdom ravaged by religious wars for nearly 40 years will succeed in breaking the deadlock. He recants his faith, converts to Catholicism, and signs the Edict of Nantes, which grants new rights to Protestants.
What Nantes did and proclaimed was a pacification, a final pacification of the religious wars plaguing France for the previous generation.
He's famously known for having said, Paris vaut bien une messe, Paris is well worth a mass. This is what one must do in order to keep our country from tearing itself apart.
Peace found, Henri IV turns to the Château de Fontainebleau. It is his favorite residence. He will stay there for 1,200 days.
What we don't know is that he is a king builder. He wanted to give its luster back to the monarchy. And he used Fontainebleau a lot to do this, where he did a lot of work. Henri IV profoundly transformed the castle.
And even then, it couldn't accommodate all the court. Lots of people stayed outside and came in to visit.
In less than 10 years, Henri IV transformed the face of the royal residence, multiplying by 4 the surface area of the castle. He ordered the construction of spacious buildings and an even larger gallery than that of his grandfather, Francis I. To improve the daily life of the court and his dining, the ruler decided on 3 new buildings that would form a new enclosure. It is La Cour des Offices, which now equips its residents with large kitchens, pantry, and cupboards.
all the kings ate well, but this was on another scale entirely. It was really a political maneuver as much as an architectural one. And when we see it today, you can't imagine that such a large assemblage of buildings was given over merely to food.
Henry IV had an obsession to transform the oval courtyard to allow better movement in his castle. He leveled the eastern part of the courtyard and enlarged it. But how to preserve all its harmony? How to give the oval courtyard a straight-lined appearance? The clever solution? Create screen facades, which also make it possible to preserve a chapel from the time of Francis I.
Nous sommes ici dans un couloir.
We are here in a corridor between the original chapel from the time of Francis I, the chapel of Saint-Saturnin's facade, and this screen facade which was installed by Henry IV's architect to unify the oval courtyard.
La cour ovale.
Thanks to this monumental trompe-l'œil, the oval courtyard no longer has an oval, only the name. But for Henry IV, the biggest project remains at work, that of water control. And for the exteriors of Fontainebleau, the king is ready for anything.
The people at that time lived with very little water at their disposal. For the king to have gushing water in his domains, he's actually showing his wealth, his power, his ability to tame the elements.
Henry IV entrusted the construction of these structures to renowned Italian hydraulic engineers, the Francini brothers.
They had the experience, they had the know-how to rebuild hydraulic structures, as well as to power and create ornamental waterworks, since they were also innovators.
At the sovereign's request, the Francinis had to place fountains in all the courtyards of the castle, a challenge for the period, which will require the installation of a very complex underground network. In total, 3 aqueducts will supply the estate's water supply. Francis I's 1.5-kilometer long one has a flow rate of about 30 liters of water per second.
There are important underground constructions, not only superstructures, but also all the infrastructure that has been built over several centuries.
But the Francinis realized that the 2 aqueducts at their disposal, those of Henry II and Francis I, would not be enough to supply all the works. They need to build a 3rd one. It will be Henry IV's aqueduct. Underground and nearly 1 kilometer long, just like the other ones, it will transport water by gravity thanks to a slope of only 1%.
Which still requires precision from a topography implementation point of view, which was incredible at the time.
The water from the aqueduct flows through the regulation and filtration basin.
In the hydraulic system, we have on this side the Henry IV aqueduct, with its central gutter that flows into this central basin. It acts as a filter. We see the deposits at the bottom of the basin. Then it has a change of direction that takes place to divert the water to the gardens.
But the Francini brothers' work does not stop there. They also need to tame the Changy rivulet, a small stream that crosses the king's property and floods his gardens. And for that they will have a clever idea: canalize the stream. The work is huge and problematic because the ground is sloping. It is necessary to redevelop the entire environment, dig on one side and backfilled on the other to create a flat surface over more than a kilometer.
We do not know exactly how this work was carried out, but it took lots of men and mechanical means to carry out the work. With animals. It took a lot of animals to transport the land, obviously, since it was being transferred from one point to another.
It must have been a small army that had to dig this canal because it involved a lot of earth-moving work.
It's a venture that nowadays seems quite incredible, knowing that at the time they didn't have the sophisticated means that we have today.
Henry IV himself is passionate about the building of the canal. His entourage reports that he can stay up to 5 to 6 hours observing the site.
He oversaw the work for days on end. He would sit watching the builders work.
In total, it will take the Francini workers 3 years to build the Grand Canal, which will become a place of entertainment and splendor for the court, and above all, the longest in France.
The Grand Canal that Henry IV had built was a novelty. There had been other similar plans d'eau water sites. It wasn't until very much later that a similar canal was built at Versailles.
The characteristics of the Grand Canal are quite impressive. It makes my head spin. With a length of 1,200 meters, a width of 37 meters, which makes a surface area of about 46,000 square meters, and a water resource capacity of 140,000 meters cubed.
Thanks to its fountains, its aqueduct, and its large canal, Henry IV thus succeeded in taming water like no king of France had done before. Mastering and expanding the environment were Henry IV's ambitious wishes. With more than 50,000 square meters of surface area, almost as much as the Palace of Versailles 100 years later, Fontainebleau was at that time the megastructure of the great century. During that time, a less expected king will contribute to the magnificence of the castle, the Sun King, a monarch whose presence in Fontainebleau is almost forgotten.
Contrary to what is often said, Louis XIV was very present at Fontainebleau. It is a little surprising, in fact, because we know that the court, at the request of the king, settled in Versailles.
And it simply isn't the case that Versailles was his only residence.
According to the experts, the Sun King is even the king who spent the most time in Fontainebleau. It was there that he signed an historic act, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, a decision that once again banned Protestantism in the kingdom. It was also there that he found refuge during the construction of Versailles.
It becomes a residence that allows the whole court to get out of Versailles.
In Fontainebleau, Louis XIV found a residence worthy of his court. The accommodation is grandiose, the communal rooms functional and comfortable. However, the Sun King lacks a large French-style garden. In 1660, he entrusted landscape architect André Le Nôtre with the creation of the Grand Parterre. The king's gardener inherits a difficult task.
He was an experienced gardener who had already started to work to create the perspectives of Versailles, who created the perspectives of Vaux-le-Vicomte. His goal will be to unify all these series of gardens that have been created by Francis I and Henry IV, and that was a new garden.
So how can you create a French formal garden from a closed space surrounded by walls?
They'll open it, they'll make the walls disappear, they'll connect the garden to its environment.
The landscape gardener decided to open and redraw all the flower beds in line with the Grand Canal. A brilliant idea that creates a spectacular perspective.
It's a perspective that goes as far as the Seine. It's really the backbone of the landscaping system wanted by André Le Nôtre, and he takes advantage of it to connect the French garden that he creates with the Grand Canal that had been built 50 years earlier under the reign of Henry IV.
With tenacity, André Le Nôtre succeeded in turning an unreadable garden into a true work of art.
It takes all the notcher's talent to set up a series of false axes, elements that go sideways, a trapezoid that succeeds in making people believe that it's a square. In other words, all these elements are like illusions.
It's in this whole way of seeing, reconfiguring, redeveloping the landscape, and reconnecting with the forest that is everywhere, that we can find André Le Nôtre's genius.
The flower bed, once decorated with boxwood embroidery, reaches unprecedented proportions. Its 4 compartments each cover 8,300 square meters.
This is a work that will come before the creation of the parterres of Versailles. But the parterres of Versailles were never as big as the ones in Fontainebleau.
It's spectacular. It's never been created with these dimensions before. They are forced gradually to abandon the use of boxwood and embroidery because it represents too much work and because ultimately the scale exceeds the human capacity to maintain them.
Today, with his 14 hectares of land, André Lenoot's work is still the largest in Europe. Thanks to his French formal gardens, his trademark, Louis XIV left a strong mark on Fontainebleau, even if he does not touch the buildings of what he considers to be a family house.
It's a house you inherit from your father or grandfather, and when you inherit something of this nature, a heritage property, a family property, you're committed to preserving it. This is exactly the guiding principle of Fontainebleau. It is the family home of the kings of France. You don't wipe out the memory of the family home of the kings of France.
Each generation has written its history by reusing the legacy of past generations. And this is what makes Fontainebleau so powerful and so interesting.
The Sun King makes great use of what his ancestors left him. In particular, the horseshoe staircase, inherited from his father, King Louis XIII. A monumental work in a totally new form that replaces an obsolete staircase.
The staircase, which was built in the 1630s, is much larger and more impressive than the first staircase. I think there is a functional reason for this demolition. It's that they wanted to allow vehicles, that is to say carriages, to be able to reach the foot of the stairs.
Thanks to its height and new shape, the carriages can now deposit the royals directly at the foot of the double flight of steps before turning around under the arches. Therefore, a more ingenious staircase, and in particular twice as big as the previous one. An exceptional footprint, 21 meters long and 21 meters wide.
It could almost have been housed inside the current staircase. There is quite a significant difference in proportions between the two.
The horseshoe staircase will allow the Sun King to stage his entries and exits from Fontainebleau in a theatrical way. Over the centuries, thanks to the contributions of the Bourbons, the great residence of the kings has held up well, at least until 1789 and the French Revolution. Fontainebleau then came close to demolition.
We even have plans for, quite terrifying when we think about it today, of the complete destruction of the royal residence. Since it is ultimately the symbol of the monarchy, there's a risk that one day someone will want to take it back. There are people who want to completely demolish these buildings that have become useless.
In the end, the superstructure, absolute symbol of the monarchy, was spared. Only its furniture is looted. A few years later, an emperor will give it back all its power. When Napoleon I seized power in 1804, he reinvested in the Château of Fontainebleau with one clear goal in mind: to simply place himself in the line of kings of the ancient regime, without attracting the wrath of the people.
I think the reason that Napoleon I chose Fontainebleau rather than Versailles is because Versailles was simply too closely associated with the Ancien Regime. Before the Revolution, Versailles was the enemy personified in bricks and mortar and marble.
But when he arrives in Fontainebleau, Napoleon inherits an empty and pitiful castle. He then relies on his official architects, Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine, also the architects of the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, to revive the building.
Napoleon is very important in the history of the castle, because not only does he have it refurbished, but it can be said to have saved it. Because if Napoleon had not been interested in Fontainebleau, if he had not decided to make it a residence of power again, what would have become of the castle?
Napoleon was all the more eager to restore Fontainebleau because he intended to invite Pope Pius VII to it on the occasion of his coronation in 1804.
The refurnishing had to be done in an absolute frenzy, with carts of furniture that arrived from Paris which made it possible to refurnish the castle.
This tour de force, a real miracle, was achieved by reinstalling, recreating apartments in this house, taking furniture from the cabinet makers who ordered them and recreating sublime apartments in record time. 19 days, they say at the time, to welcome the Pope.
But Napoleon did not stop there. If Fontainebleau is to embody the empire, it must be sealed with his seal. In 1808, he ordered the creation of his throne room in place of the king's room.
Under the Empire, Napoleon didn't want to reuse the room of his predecessors. He wanted to show that there was a definitive change, which was the change the Revolution brought, so it was no longer a question of reusing the royal ceremonial. The bed is removed, but symbolically the throne is installed in its place, which is to say, the very symbol of his own power. Fontainebleau is not a summer residence. It is not a second residence. It is a place where he will be able to exercise the fullness of power. The presence of the throne room is what that implies.
During his reign, Napoleon I welcomed all the crowned heads of Europe to this room. Today it is the only one in France preserved in its historical state and with its original furniture. The emperor is also the last occupant of the castle to change its orientation. For him who wants to stand out from the Bourbon, the main entrance must face the city, the people. He had a wing of the Court of Honor, which was created 300 years earlier, destroyed and replaced with a majestic gate, which he fashioned in his glory.
On the gate, we find the N of the crowned emperor. The eagles that are on either side of the front door. And then there is Jupiter's lightning also, Napoleon effectively assimilating Jupiter's power.
But the glory and power displayed at the entrance of the palace will not be enough to protect the emperor from his setbacks during the campaigns of Russia and Central Europe.
Fontainebleau is the last refuge of Napoleon in a France completely besieged and invaded by foreign troops.
Forced to abdicate, it was at Fontainebleau that Napoleon bid farewell to France before leaving for the island of Elba on April 20th, 1814.
The troops are in line, waiting for the emperor. The emperor arrives with his hat in his hand, puts on his hat, kisses the flag, and addresses his old guard in extremely moving terms.
Goodbye, my children. I would like to press you all to my heart, that I at least kiss your flag. Napoleon will have definitely left his mark in Fontainebleau, even if he only spent a short time there, less than 6 months, too busy on the battlefield. But a few decades later, Napoleon III, who was crowned emperor in 1852 after his coup d'etat, would continue his uncle's work. He resides mainly in Paris at the Palais des Tuileries. However, he could not abandon Fontainebleau. The castle is part of his heritage.
I think in his mind, it was important to strengthen the dynastic associations that he had with his uncle, because Napoleon I was closely associated with the Château of Fontainebleau, and Napoleon III wanted that association to be preeminent in the public mind.
From 1857 onwards, Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie spent their summers in Fontainebleau. The castle is prestigious, enough to receive the Parisian court, but not only.
Like all the rulers, Napoleon III used the castle of Fontainebleau as a tool of his diplomacy. He received in this residence many crowned heads from all over the world.
A problem. Fontainebleau lacks a theater. However, for the emperor, who will order the construction of Opéra Garnier, it is not a luxury but a strategic piece of his diplomacy. In 1854, Napoleon III entrusted this task to Hector Le Fuel, one of the Louvre's architects.
The theatre of Napoleon III and Eugénie in Fontainebleau was created in the euphoria of the beginning of Napoleon III's reign, at the time when the empire was being established, when a court society was being rebuilt after the episode of the 1848 revolution.
But where to create a 400-seat theater in Fontainebleau and quickly, because the emperor is in a hurry? The architect will have to take up the challenge. The emperor's trusted man has a surprising idea. Instead of building a new building, he wants to use a wing of the main courtyard in which to insert his work.
From
the moment the building existed, it was easier to free yourself from the foundation questions and all of these things. The architect designed several theatre projects, which were rather difficult to design given the short distance between the facades. Theatres in the 19th century were generally relatively large.
Finally, in a building only 14 meters wide, the architect succeeded in not only creating the stage, but also an oval room large enough to accommodate the court and its guests. He managed to insert a circle into a square.
So the insertion into the wing was complicated. First, because of the relatively narrow structure, and then because of the different levels that had to be installed. Obviously, respecting the ground level and the roof, the wing was completely emptied and the roof removed, and from that moment on, they were able to rebuild the theatre inside these two facades.
He managed to shoehorn a really very small theater into a wing of the chateau without changing the envelope, the outside. You'd never know there's a theater in there until you open the door and go in.
The result, a richly decorated hall 42 meters long by 14 meters wide, with a capacity of 430 spectators.
What is extraordinary is that this room was created by Hector Lefuel in record time. We're talking about a year and a half. People worked day and night.
Inaugurated in 1857 for the arrival of the Grand Duke Constantine of Russia, they will say of this room that it was one of the most elegant that one can dream of, a real jewel. Over time, the small hunting lodge in Fontainebleau has been transformed into a sprawling palace with gigantic galleries, 4 courtyards, an impressive canal, the largest parterre in Europe, and a private theater. The castle housed all the crowned heads of France. From Saint Louis to the Bonapartes, it has established itself as an instrument of royal and imperial power. Napoleon I renamed it the true residence of the kings, the house of the centuries.